Broken glass crunched beneath steel-toed boots as shadows moved through the abandoned warehouse. In the corner, zip-tied to a metal chair, CEO Noelle Draven fought against restraints that cut deeper with every movement. Her captors had underestimated one crucial detail: the maintenance worker they'd ignored wasn't just any janitor. Conan Cliver had spent 8 years perfecting combat techniques that most people only saw in movies. When he heard muffled screams echoing through the Thornfield Industrial Complex that Tuesday night, every instinct from his past training screamed danger. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He moved. What happened in the next 17 minutes would save a life, destroy a conspiracy, and create a bond that neither of them saw coming. Because sometimes the person who rescues you isn't the one you'd expect. And sometimes the most powerful executives in the world discover that their greatest strength comes not from boardrooms, but from learning to trust a single father who risks everything to protect others. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Thornfield Industrial Complex had been abandoned for 3 years. But tonight it pulsed with dangerous energy. Conan Cliver pushed his maintenance cart through the shadows of Building C, checking the security systems that protected the tech companies now occupying the renovated sections of the massive facility. His footsteps echoed against concrete walls that had once housed manufacturing equipment, now converted into sleek office spaces and server farms. The complex sprawled across 47 acres on the outskirts of Millhaven, a labyrinth of interconnected buildings that had once produced automotive parts for half the country. When the factory closed, visionary developers had transformed it into a hub for technology companies, keeping the industrial bones but filling them with fiber optic cables and climate-controlled environments. Conan worked the night shift, ensuring the building systems ran smoothly while the office workers were safely home. He'd been making his rounds for 6 months. Now, long enough to know that Building C stayed empty after 7 p.m. The executive suites on the 3rd floor housed Draven Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing software companies in the region. But CEO Noelle Draven rarely stayed past standard business hours. Her corner office had remained dark every night since Conan started this job. That's why the muffled sound from the warehouse section stopped him cold. Building C had 3 main areas: the renovated office floors, the server rooms in the basement, and the original warehouse space that remained largely unused. The sound had come from there, something between a thump and a cry that didn't belong in an empty building. Conan paused his cart beside the freight elevator, every nerve suddenly alert. He'd learned to trust his instincts during 8 years of intensive combat training at the Riverside Athletic Combat Academy. The school specialized in teaching real-world self-defense to civilians, combining elements of Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and tactical response training. What started as a way to build confidence had become an obsession for Conan, a discipline that gave structure to his life as a single father struggling to make ends meet. The sound came again, definitely from the warehouse level. Conan abandoned his cart and moved toward the freight elevator, his hand automatically checking the tactical pen in his uniform pocket. The tool looked innocuous, but could serve as a weapon if necessary, one of many practical skills he'd absorbed during years of training. The warehouse level smelled of dust and motor oil, cavernous and dimly lit by emergency lighting. Conan moved silently along the perimeter, using shadows for cover as he'd been taught. The space was mostly empty except for a few storage containers and some abandoned machinery from the building's industrial past. He heard voices before he saw the light. 3 men clustered around a battery-powered work lamp in the far corner of the warehouse. They wore dark clothing and moved with the casual confidence of people who believed they were completely alone. Between them, zip-tied to a metal folding chair, sat a woman in a torn business suit. Even in the harsh light, Conan recognized her immediately. Noelle Draven's photo had been in the business section of the Millhaven Tribune countless times over the past 2 years. At 34, she'd built Draven Dynamics from a startup in her apartment to a company valued at over $200 million. Her software solutions had revolutionized how small businesses manage their operations, earning her recognition as one of the region's most innovative entrepreneurs. Now, she sat bound and bleeding from a cut above her left eyebrow, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and desperate. Her captors had positioned her so she faced away from the main warehouse entrance, but Conan could see the terror in her posture even from a distance. "The transfer better go through tonight," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the empty space. "Boss wants this wrapped up before anyone realizes she's missing." "What if she doesn't cooperate?" asked another, younger-sounding voice. The third man, clearly the leader, walked around to face Noel directly. "She'll cooperate. When you're looking at concrete shoes and a deep lake, cooperation comes naturally." Conan counted 3 opponents, all larger than his own 5'10" frame. The leader carried himself like someone comfortable with violence, while the other 2 seemed nervous but committed. They had positioned themselves well tactically, with clear sight lines to both entrances and no obvious blind spots. But they had made one crucial mistake. They hadn't posted a lookout. Conan's training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating angles and distances while his body moved into position. 8 years of combat practice had taught him that real fights were nothing like movies. They were brutal, fast, and decided by preparation rather than dramatic gestures. The key was to eliminate the greatest threats first and use surprise as your primary weapon. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to 911. "Armed kidnapping in progress. Thornfield Industrial Complex Building C warehouse level. Send backup immediately." He set the phone to silent and tucked it away, knowing that police response would take at least 12 minutes, even if they believed the report immediately. Noel Draven didn't have 12 minutes. The leader was now crouched directly in front of her, speaking in low, threatening tones about bank transfers and access codes. His 2 companions had relaxed slightly, one leaning against a support pillar while the other checked his phone. "Perfect." Conan moved. He approached from the leader's blind side, using a support beam as cover until he was within striking distance. The tactical pen came out smoothly, held in a reverse grip as he'd practiced thousands of times. His first target was the man by the pillar, who went down silently with a precise strike to a pressure point on his neck. The phone checker looked up just in time to see Conan coming. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Conan's forearm caught him across the throat, cutting off sound and air simultaneously. A quick follow-up strike rendered him unconscious, his phone clattering across the concrete floor. The leader spun around at the sound, his hand moving toward a gun tucked into his waistband. But 8 years of training had taught Conan that hesitation was death. He closed the distance in 2 steps, his tactical pen striking precisely at the nerve cluster in the man's wrist. The gun fell from nerveless fingers as the leader stumbled backward, cursing and clutching his disabled hand. "You picked the wrong building," Conan said quietly, positioning himself between the leader and the fallen weapon. The fight that followed was brief and decisive. The leader was strong and experienced, but Conan's training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. He used the man's size against him, redirecting momentum and attacking vulnerable points until his opponent collapsed beside his unconscious companions. 17 minutes after hearing the first muffled cry, Conan was cutting through Noel's restraints with a utility knife from his maintenance belt. Her hands shook as circulation returned, and she stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping her stand on unsteady legs. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking from him to the 3 unconscious men. "Who are you? How did you do that?" "Maintenance worker," Conan replied, already hearing sirens in the distance. Wrong place, right time, but Noel wasn't looking at him like he was just a maintenance worker. She was looking at him like he was something she'd never encountered before, someone who had risked everything to save a stranger, expecting nothing in return. 6 years earlier, Conan Cliver had been a different man entirely. He'd worked as a software engineer at Meridian Technologies, designing security protocols for financial institutions. The work paid well and offered excellent benefits, perfect for supporting his wife Lisa and their quiet life in suburban Millhaven. They'd bought a modest house in the Westbrook neighborhood, close to good schools and walking distance from the park where they planned to take their future family. Lisa worked as a physical therapist at Millhaven General Hospital, helping patients recover from injuries and surgeries. She had a gift for encouraging people through their most difficult moments, finding ways to motivate them when progress seemed impossible. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and shared dreams of building something meaningful together. Accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in October, just like so many tragedies that tear through ordinary lives without warning. Lisa was driving to work through an intersection she'd navigated safely hundreds of times before. The drunk driver ran the red light at 60 miles per hour, hitting her small sedan on the driver's side with devastating force. Conan received the call at his office, where he'd been debugging code and thinking about what to make for dinner. The voice on the phone was professional but kind, explaining that his wife had been involved in a serious accident and asking him to come to the hospital immediately. He'd driven there in a haze of disbelief, unable to process that his carefully ordered world was collapsing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lisa lived for 6 hours after the impact, long enough for Conan to hold her hand and tell her he loved her, but not long enough for him to understand how he was supposed to continue existing without her. The doctors explained the medical details with compassionate efficiency, but all Conan heard was that the person who made his life meaningful was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. The funeral filled Millhaven's largest church. Lisa had touched hundreds of lives through her work, and patients she'd helped walked with better posture or moved with less pain because of her dedication. Conan sat in the front row, accepting condolences from colleagues and friends who meant well but couldn't understand the magnitude of his loss. After the funeral, Conan discovered that grief had its own timeline, unrelated to work schedules or social expectations. He tried to return to his normal routine, sitting at his computer and writing code while his mind replayed memories of Lisa's laugh or the way she hummed while making coffee in the morning. His productivity plummeted, and his colleagues grew concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior. The breaking point came 4 months after the accident, when Conan realized he'd been staring at the same screen for 3 hours without accomplishing anything meaningful. His supervisor called him into a private meeting and gently suggested that perhaps he needed more time to process his loss. The conversation was kind but firm. Meridian Technologies would hold his position open for 6 months, but he needed to take care of himself before he could effectively take care of his responsibilities. Conan cleaned out his desk that afternoon, packing up personal photos and small mementos while his coworkers watched with sympathetic expressions. He drove home to the house that still smelled like Lisa's perfume and felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. For the first time since the accident, Conan acknowledged that he was drowning. The idea of combat training came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, the grief counselor Lisa's hospital had recommended, suggested that physical activity might help Conan process emotions he couldn't express through conversation. Grief has to go somewhere, she explained during one of their sessions. If you don't give it a constructive outlet, it will find destructive ones. Conan had never considered himself athletic, but something about the controlled violence of combat training appealed to his emotional state. The Riverside Athletic Combat Academy offered civilian classes that promised practical self-defense skills combined with physical conditioning. The instructor, a former professional fighter named Jake Santos, emphasized that real combat was about discipline and preparation, rather than anger or aggression. "We don't teach people to start fights," Jake explained during Conan's first class. We teach them to finish fights that other people start. There's a big difference. The training was brutal and humbling. Conan's first week left him exhausted and covered in bruises. His body screaming protests about movements it had never been asked to perform. But for the first time since Lisa's death, his mind was quiet. During those 2 hours on the training mat, he couldn't think about anything except breathing, balance, and the precise execution of techniques that might save his life in a real emergency. As months passed, combat training became Conan's anchor. He progressed through the academy's curriculum systematically, learning Krav Maga striking techniques, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grappling, and tactical response protocols. The physical conditioning transformed his body, but more importantly, the mental discipline gave him tools for managing grief that traditional therapy had struggled to provide. Jake Santos became both instructor and mentor, recognizing that Conan's dedication came from a deeper place than most students. "You train like your life depends on it," Jake observed after one particularly intense session. "That's good, but remember that the goal is to build a life worth protecting, not just to become someone who can't be hurt." The wisdom in those words took years for Conan to fully understand. By his 3rd year at the academy, Conan had achieved instructor-level proficiency in multiple disciplines. He could disarm opponents, neutralize threats, and handle himself in situations that would overwhelm most civilians. But the skills came with a responsibility he hadn't anticipated. Several times each year, he found himself in situations where his training made the difference between safety and disaster. The first incident happened at a convenience store where Conan was buying coffee after a late training session. 2 men with knives attempted to rob the elderly clerk, threatening violence if he didn't empty the register immediately. Conan's intervention was swift and decisive, neutralizing both threats before anyone was seriously injured. The local newspaper ran a small story about a good Samaritan stopping a robbery, but Conan declined to be interviewed. Similar situations followed with surprising regularity. A drunk driver threatening other motorists at a traffic light. A domestic violence situation in the apartment complex where Conan had moved after selling the house he'd shared with Lisa. A mugging attempt in the parking garage where he worked part-time. Security. Each incident reinforced the same truth. His training gave him the ability to help people who couldn't help themselves, but it also isolated him from normal civilian life. Friends and colleagues began treating him differently after witnessing his capabilities, as if his skills made him somehow dangerous or unpredictable. The isolation deepened when Conan realized he preferred it that way. Social interactions felt shallow compared to the clarity of physical training. Relationships seemed fragile when measured against the permanence of loss he'd experienced with Lisa. It was easier to focus on perfecting techniques and maintaining physical condition than to risk caring about someone who might disappear without warning. By his 5th year of training, Conan had achieved what Jake Santos called functional mastery, the ability to handle most real-world combat situations with confidence and precision. But mastery brought its own challenges. The more capable he became, the more responsible he felt for protecting others. Every time he witnessed injustice or vulnerability, his training demanded action. The night shift maintenance job at Thornfield Industrial Complex was supposed to be a step toward normal life. The work was steady and solitary, perfect for someone who'd grown uncomfortable with close human contact. The building's security systems gave him a sense of purpose, without requiring him to interact extensively with other people. Walking through empty hallways at 2 a.m., checking climate controls and surveillance monitors, Conan could almost imagine he was protecting something important without getting emotionally invested in the outcome. The job paid enough to cover his modest expenses while leaving time for continued training at the academy. He'd been telling himself this routine was sustainable, that he could maintain indefinite emotional distance while using his skills to help strangers in crisis. The night he heard Noel Draven's muffled cries, Conan believed he was simply doing what his training had prepared him to do, neutralizing a threat and protecting someone in danger. He had no idea that saving her life would force him to confront the question Jake Santos had posed years earlier. What kind of life was he actually building, and was it worth protecting? Noelle Draven had built an empire from lines of code and exhausting determination, but she'd never realized that success could become its own form of captivity. At 34, she was the face of Draven Dynamics, the company she'd founded in her cramped apartment above a bakery in downtown Millhaven. What had started as a simple software solution for small business, inventory management, had evolved into a comprehensive platform serving over 10,000 companies across the region. The business magazines loved her story. Brilliant woman from humble beginnings who revolutionized how entrepreneurs managed their operations. The photograph showed her in elegant suits, standing confidently in her corner office overlooking Millhaven's revitalized downtown district. She spoke at conferences about innovation and perseverance, inspiring audiences with stories of 18-hour workdays and breakthrough moments that came at 3 in the morning. What the magazines didn't report was that Noelle's success had cost her the ability to make choices about her own life. The transformation had been so gradual that she hadn't noticed it happening. Trevor Ashworth had joined Draven Dynamics as Chief Financial Officer during the company's second year, when Noelle was struggling to manage rapid growth while maintaining the personal touch that made her software solution so effective. Trevor brought impressive credentials from larger corporations and promised to handle the financial complexities that were consuming too much of Noelle's creative energy. Initially, Trevor's involvement felt like salvation. He streamlined the accounting processes, established relationships with investors, and created the operational framework that allowed Draven Dynamics to scale without losing its innovative edge. Noelle could focus on product development while Trevor managed the business side, a partnership that seemed ideal for both their skills and interests. The first signs of control were subtle and seemingly protective. Trevor suggested that Noelle's casual communication style might confuse investors who expected more formal corporate presentations. He helped her craft speeches and press releases that sounded more professional, editing her natural voice into language that impressed financial analysts but felt foreign in her mouth. "You're brilliant with technology," Trevor would say during their planning meetings, "but business communications require a different skill set. Let me handle the messaging while you focus on what you do best." The logic seemed reasonable, so Noelle allowed Trevor to manage more of her external communications. Interviews with journalists went through him first. Speaking engagements required his approval to ensure they aligned with company strategy. Email responses to major clients were drafted by his team and sent under her signature. Gradually, Noelle's public persona became a carefully crafted performance that bore little resemblance to her actual personality. The real Noelle was curious and informal, someone who learned best through conversation and experimentation. The public Noelle was polished and authoritative, delivering scripted remarks that impressed audiences but felt like reading someone else's thoughts. The financial controls developed more slowly but with devastating effectiveness. Trevor convinced Noelle that combining their personal and professional finances would streamline operations and provide better investment opportunities. He established joint accounts and investment portfolios that technically belonged to both of them but were managed entirely by his team. "Your time is worth more spent on development than managing portfolios," he explained when Noelle questioned why she couldn't access detailed financial statements. "Trust me to handle the money while you handle the innovation." By Draven Dynamics' fourth year, Noelle had become financially dependent on Trevor, despite being the company's founder and primary creative force. Her salary was paid into accounts she couldn't access independently. Her stock options were managed through investment vehicles that required Trevor's approval to liquidate. Even her personal expenses went through approval processes that Trevor's assistants monitored carefully. The isolation from friends and family happened through a combination of practical constraints and emotional manipulation. Noelle's schedule became so demanding that maintaining personal relationships required heroic effort. Trevor's team managed her calendar with military precision, filling every available hour with meetings, development sessions, and strategic planning. When Noelle tried to carve out time for lunch with her sister, Maya, or evening calls with college friends, Trevor would express disappointment about missed opportunities or delayed projects. He never explicitly forbade personal relationships, but he made the costs of maintaining them so high that Noelle gradually stopped trying. "I understand you want to see Maya," he would say when Noelle blocked out Saturday afternoon for family time, "but the investors are expecting our quarterly report Monday morning, and we're still behind on the market analysis. Maybe we could reschedule with Maya for next month when things calm down." Things never calmed down. There was always another deadline, another investor presentation, another strategic imperative that required Noelle's immediate attention. Her personal life shrank to the boundaries of work obligations, until she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a conversation that wasn't about company business. The romantic relationship with Trevor had developed alongside the business partnership, though Noelle struggled to identify when friendship had transitioned into something more intimate. Trevor was handsome and intelligent, someone who understood her work better than anyone else in her life. Their late-night strategy sessions sometimes extended into personal conversations, and Trevor's attention felt like appreciation for aspects of her personality that business associates never saw. But their romantic relationship followed the same patterns as their business partnership. Trevor made reservations at restaurants he preferred, planned vacation trips that aligned with industry conferences, and suggested activities that would enhance their professional network. Even their most intimate moments felt scheduled and strategic, as if spontaneity might disrupt carefully orchestrated plans. Noelle told herself that this was what successful couples did. They aligned their personal and professional goals to maximize mutual benefit. Trevor seemed to love her, and he certainly understood her ambitions better than anyone she'd ever dated. If their relationship felt more like a business merger than a romance, perhaps that was simply how mature adults approached partnership. The engagement had been announced at a company board meeting, presented as wonderful news that would strengthen Draven Dynamics' leadership structure. The ring was beautiful and expensive, chosen by Trevor's assistant and presented during a dinner with major investors. Noelle's acceptance felt less like a romantic decision and more like a logical next step in their professional collaboration. Wedding planning became another project managed by Trevor's team, with vendors selected based on their ability to enhance the company's reputation rather than Noelle's personal preferences. The guest list included clients, investors, and industry contacts who could benefit Draven Dynamics' future growth. The ceremony would be photographed for business publications that wanted to feature successful entrepreneur couples. By the time Noelle realized how completely her life had been managed by other people's decisions, she felt too isolated and financially dependent to change course. Breaking up with Trevor would mean disrupting Draven Dynamics' leadership structure. Leaving the company would mean abandoning the technology platform she'd created and the employees who depended on her vision. Most terrifying of all, she'd lost touch with her own judgment about what she actually wanted. After years of having decisions filtered through Trevor's strategic analysis, Noelle couldn't trust her own instincts about relationships, career directions, or personal happiness. Every choice felt dangerous because she'd forgotten how to evaluate options independently. The night she was kidnapped, Noelle had been working late in her office, trying to understand discrepancies in financial reports that didn't match her understanding of company performance. Trevor was out of town at an investor conference, and his absence had given her the first opportunity in months to examine company documents without oversight. What she discovered was evidence of systematic financial manipulation that had been happening for over 2 years. Money was being diverted from company accounts into investment vehicles that benefited Trevor personally while reducing Draven Dynamics' actual profitability. Contracts with vendors included hidden fees that inflated costs while providing kickbacks to Trevor's network. Most damaging of all, Trevor had been presenting falsified financial statements to investors, claiming company performance that didn't match actual revenue. Draven Dynamics was nowhere near as successful as the public reports indicated, and the company was potentially months away from insolvency. If the current practices continued, Noel had printed copies of the most incriminating documents and was preparing to drive them to the FBI field office when 3 men appeared in her office doorway. They identified themselves as associates of Trevor's who needed to discuss some urgent business matters. When Noel tried to call security, she discovered that her phone had been disconnected and her computer access had been revoked. The men escorted her to the parking garage with professional courtesy that masked absolute determination. They explained that Trevor was concerned about some misunderstandings regarding company finances, and that a brief conversation would clear up any confusion. The drive to the Thornfield Industrial Complex warehouse felt like traveling toward her own execution. Sitting zip-tied to a metal chair, listening to men discuss her murder as if it were a routine business transaction, Noel finally understood the true cost of allowing other people to make her choices. She'd traded her autonomy for the illusion of success, and now she was going to die because she'd been too afraid to trust her own judgment about the man who'd systematically destroy her independence. When the maintenance worker appeared like something from an action movie, neutralizing her captors with skills that seemed impossible for someone wearing a janitor's uniform, Noel's first thought wasn't gratitude. It was wonder that such a person existed. Someone who acted decisively to protect a stranger, expecting nothing in return. Guided by principles she'd forgotten were possible, looking at Conan Cliver in the harsh light of the warehouse, Noel realized she was seeing something she'd lost track of entirely. A person who made choices based on his own moral compass rather than external expectations or strategic calculations. She had no idea how to be that kind of person anymore, but watching him, she remembered that she wanted to learn. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes after Conan's 911 call, followed closely by 3 police cruisers and a detective who looked like she'd been roused from sleep for an emergency that sounded too strange to be real. The Thornfield Industrial Complex suddenly blazed with emergency lights, transforming the abandoned warehouse into a crime scene that would require hours of documentation and investigation. Paramedic Jenny Walsh checked Noel's injuries with practiced efficiency while Detective Sarah Morrison interviewed Conan near the unconscious kidnappers. All 3 men were breathing normally but showed no signs of regaining consciousness anytime soon. Morrison had seen enough crime scenes to recognize professional work when she encountered it. "You said you're a maintenance worker," Detective Morrison repeated, looking from her notepad to Conan's uniform and back again. "Mind explaining how a maintenance worker takes down 3 armed men without sustaining any injuries?" "Combat training," Conan replied simply. "Civilian classes at Riverside Athletic Combat Academy. 8 years of study. 8 years is a long time for hobby classes," Morrison observed. What motivated that level of commitment? Conan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that suggested the question touched emotional territory he preferred not to discuss. "Personal reasons. Loss of someone important. Training helped with processing grief." Morrison nodded, recognizing the careful language of someone who'd learned to discuss trauma without revealing details. She'd interviewed enough victims and witnesses to understand that some stories were too personal to share with strangers, even sympathetic professionals doing their jobs. Meanwhile, Paramedic Walsh was discovering that her patient was more concerned about her rescuer than her own injuries. Noel's cut required 3 stitches, and she had rope burns on her wrists from the zip ties, but her attention kept drifting to the quiet conversation between Conan and Detective Morrison. "He saved my life," Noel said as Walsh cleaned the wound on her forehead. "Those men were planning to kill me after I transferred money from company accounts. If he hadn't been here, hadn't acted when he did, I'd be dead. You're lucky he was making rounds at the right time. Walsh agreed, applying antiseptic with gentle precision. Not many people would have gotten involved in a situation like this. That's what I don't understand, Noel said, wincing slightly as the antiseptic stung. He didn't know who I was, didn't know if helping me would put him in danger, didn't know if there might be more kidnappers. He just heard someone in trouble and acted. Walsh paused in her work, studying Noel's expression. As a paramedic, she'd responded to countless emergencies where bystanders had chosen not to get involved, where potential helpers had decided that someone else's crisis wasn't worth personal risk. She'd also seen the psychological impact on victims who survived because one person decided to act when everyone else looked away. Some people are wired differently, Walsh said quietly. They see someone in danger and can't walk away. It's not common, but it's real. Across the warehouse, Detective Morrison was reaching similar conclusions about Conan's character. His story was consistent, his actions matched his stated motivations, and his background check had returned nothing more interesting than a speeding ticket from 2 years earlier. The man who'd neutralized 3 kidnappers with clinical efficiency was exactly what he claimed to be. A maintenance worker with unusual skills who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Morrison was puzzled by one detail that didn't fit the standard Good Samaritan narrative. When she'd asked Conan about his plans for the rest of the evening, assuming he'd want to go home and decompress from the traumatic experience, he'd looked genuinely surprised by the question. "I need to finish my shift," Conan had said. "The building systems still require monitoring, and someone needs to reset the security protocols after all this activity. You want to go back to work?" Morrison had asked. "After what just happened here?" "The job doesn't stop because of an emergency," Conan replied matter-of-factly. "The technical systems don't care about personal drama," the response revealed. Something about Conan's character that Morrison found both admirable and concerning. He possessed the rare courage to risk his safety for a stranger, but he seemed unable to acknowledge that what he'd done was extraordinary. In his mind, he'd simply performed a routine maintenance task that happened to involve unconscious kidnappers instead of malfunctioning air conditioning units. The investigation took 3 hours to complete. Crime scene technicians photographed everything, collected evidence, and documented the precise positions where each kidnapper had fallen. The 3 men were transported to Millhaven General Hospital under police guard, where they would receive medical treatment before being formally charged with kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. By 2:30 in the morning, only Conan, Noel, and Detective Morrison remained in the warehouse. Morrison had all the information she needed for her initial report, but she developed concerns about releasing both witnesses without ensuring they had adequate protection from potential retaliation. "We don't know who hired these men," Morrison explained as they walked toward the warehouse exit. "Ms. Draven, you mentioned financial irregularities at your company that might have motivated this attack. Until we understand the full scope of the conspiracy, you could still be in danger." Noel nodded, though she looked more exhausted than frightened. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the kidnapping and rescue had faded, leaving her struggling to process the magnitude of what had almost happened. "I need to contact my attorney and arrange for somewhere safe to stay while you investigate. What about family?" Morrison asked. "Parents, siblings, close friends who could provide support?" "My sister Maya lives in California," Noel said after a long pause. "My parents are in Florida. I don't really have close friends in Millhaven anymore. My social circle became pretty limited to business associates over the past few years." The admission revealed more about Noel's isolation than she'd intended. Morrison exchanged a glance with Conan, recognizing that the successful CEO had fewer personal resources than many crime victims who lived paycheck to paycheck. "I could recommend a hotel with good security," Morrison offered. "Somewhere downtown with doormen and surveillance systems." But as they reached the parking area outside the warehouse, a new problem became apparent. Noel's car keys, purse and phone were still somewhere in the building where she'd been taken, and she had no immediate way to access money, transportation, or communication. The kidnappers had isolated her so completely that even being rescued left her stranded. Conan had been quiet during the conversation about Noel's safety arrangements, but as they stood in the parking area under the harsh security lights, he made an offer that surprised everyone, including himself. "I have a spare bedroom," he said, addressing his words to Detective Morrison as if seeking official approval for an irregular suggestion. "Temporary shelter until Ms. Draven can arrange something more permanent. The apartment has good security, and I'll be home during daylight hours when most businesses are open." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You're offering to house a kidnapping victim you met 3 hours ago?" "She needs somewhere safe to stay," Conan replied. "I have space and security." "Seems practical." Noel stared at him with the same bewildered expression she'd worn in the warehouse when he'd first appeared to save her life. The offer was completely outside her experience of how people interacted, especially strangers who'd already done more for her than anyone had a right to expect. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would you do that? You don't know anything about me, about my situation, about what kind of trouble this might bring to your life." Conan considered the question seriously before answering. "You were in danger and needed help. Now you're safe but need shelter. I can provide shelter." "The logic is straightforward." "But you don't owe me anything," Noel protested. "You already saved my life." "That's more than enough." "It's not about owing," Conan said, his voice gentle but certain. "It's about having the ability to help and choosing to use it." Detective Morrison watched this exchange with professional interest. She'd seen many crime victims struggle to accept help from strangers, especially when their normal support systems had been compromised. But she'd also learned to trust her instincts about people's character, and everything about Conan Cliver suggested someone who could be trusted with the responsibility he was volunteering to accept. "Ms. Draven," Morrison said carefully, "this is obviously your choice to make. But from a safety perspective, Mr. Cliver's offer has some advantages over a hotel. More privacy, better control over who knows your location, and you've already seen that he can handle himself if trouble develops." Noel looked between the detective and her unexpected rescuer, trying to understand how her life had shifted so dramatically in the space of a few hours. This morning she'd been trapped in a carefully controlled existence where every decision was filtered through other people's agendas. Tonight she was being offered genuine choice by someone who seemed to expect nothing in return except the opportunity to help. "Are you sure?" she asked Conan, studying his face for signs of ulterior motives or hidden expectations. "This is asking a lot from someone you just met." "I'm sure," he replied without hesitation. "You need somewhere safe to stay." "I have somewhere safe. The rest we can figure out as we go." Standing in the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse at 3 in the morning, surrounded by the aftermath of a crime that had nearly cost her life, Noel made the first independent decision she'd made in years. She chose to trust the maintenance worker who'd risked everything to save her, not because logic dictated that choice, but because every instinct she'd learned to suppress was telling her that Conan Cliver was exactly what he appeared to be, someone who acted according to his principles rather than his advantages. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'd like to accept your offer." Detective Morrison nodded approvingly and handed them both her business card. "I'll need to speak with both of you again tomorrow as the investigation continues. Ms. Draven will also need to coordinate with federal authorities about the financial crimes you discovered. This case is going to get complicated quickly." As they drove away from Thornfield Industrial Complex in Conan's modest Honda Civic, Noel realized she was experiencing something she hadn't felt in years: the strange comfort of being in a situation where she didn't have to perform, impress, or strategically manage her image. Conan drove quietly through the empty streets, occasionally checking his mirrors, but otherwise focused on the simple task of getting them safely to his apartment. For the first time since she could remember, Noelle was with someone who seemed to have no agenda beyond basic human decency. The feeling was so unfamiliar that she almost didn't recognize it as relief. Morning brought complications that made the previous night's kidnapping seem like the opening move in a much larger game. Conan's apartment was a converted space above a used bookstore in Millhaven's Arts District, accessible through a narrow staircase that provided natural security and privacy. The living space was modest but comfortable, with one bedroom, a compact kitchen, and a living room dominated by bookshelves and fitness equipment. Noelle had slept fitfully on the pull-out couch, waking every few hours to the unfamiliar sounds of a neighborhood she'd never spent time in despite living in Millhaven for over a decade. The morning light streaming through windows that faced east instead of south reminded her how completely her normal routine had been disrupted. Conan was already awake when she emerged from the bathroom, dressed in his maintenance uniform and preparing coffee with the methodical precision of someone who'd perfected the ritual through repetition. He'd laid out clean towels, a spare toothbrush still in its package, and a selection of breakfast options that suggested he'd been planning for her comfort since they'd arrived. "How did you sleep?" he asked, handing her a coffee mug that was perfectly heated and stronger than anything she'd had in months. "Better than I expected," Noelle admitted, settling into one of the mismatched kitchen chairs that somehow felt more comfortable than the designer furniture in her apartment. "I keep thinking I should be more traumatized by what happened, but mostly I feel relieved." Conan studied her expression while buttering toast with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to every task. "Relieved that it's over, or relieved that someone was there to help?" "Both," Noelle said, then paused to consider whether there was more to her emotional response. "But also relieved that I finally understand how bad things had gotten. I've been telling myself for months that something felt wrong, but I kept dismissing my instincts as paranoia or stress." "What kind of wrong?" Conan asked, his tone neutral but attentive in a way that encouraged honesty. Noelle had been avoiding this conversation since they'd left the warehouse, but sitting in Conan's kitchen with morning light, making everything feel safer, she found herself explaining the full scope of what she'd discovered about Trevor's financial manipulation. The story poured out of her in a rush of details about falsified reports, diverted funds, and systematic isolation that had left her unable to trust her own judgment about her business or her relationship. Conan listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated he was following the financial complexities, but never making judgments about her choices or reactions. When she finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she'd told him. "How long had you suspected the financial problems?" he finally asked. "Months," Noelle admitted. "Maybe longer. There were little things that didn't add up, reports that conflicted with my understanding of our actual performance. But every time I tried to investigate, Trevor would explain it as normal business complexity that I didn't need to worry about." "And you believed him?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it forced Noelle to confront something she'd been avoiding. "I wanted to believe him," she said slowly. "It was easier to trust his expertise than to acknowledge that I'd lost control of my own company." Conan's phone buzzed against the kitchen table, displaying Detective Morrison's number. He answered immediately, and Noelle could hear the urgency in Morrison's voice, even though she couldn't make out specific words. "We'll be there in an hour," Conan said, ending the call and looking at Noelle with an expression that suggested the situation had just become significantly more complicated. "The 3 men from last night," he explained, already moving toward the door to retrieve his jacket. "They've started talking, and what they're saying changes everything about this case." Detective Morrison's office at Millhaven Police Headquarters felt like a neutral zone where the normal rules of social interaction were suspended in favor of facts and evidence. Morrison had spread documents across her desk in organized piles, each representing a different aspect of what had started as a kidnapping investigation and was rapidly evolving into something much larger. Trevor Ashworth is not who he claims to be, Morrison began without preamble. The credentials he used to join Draven Dynamics were fabricated, and his real name is Trevor Morrison, no relation to me, she added dryly. He's been involved in similar financial fraud schemes in 3 other states over the past 8 years. Noelle felt the room tilt slightly as she processed this information. Similar schemes? His pattern is consistent, Morrison continued, consulting her notes. He targets successful entrepreneurs who've built companies quickly and haven't established sophisticated financial oversight. He joins their organizations as a financial expert, gradually takes control of their business and personal finances, then systematically drains their assets while preparing for either a hostile takeover or complete liquidation. How many companies? Conan asked. 4 that we've identified so far, probably more. Total estimated theft is over $15 million. None of his previous victims reported the crimes, because he made sure they were too financially and emotionally compromised to fight back. Effectively, Morrison pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents that painted a picture of methodical predation spanning nearly a decade. Trevor Ashworth or Morrison, or whatever his real name was, had perfected a technique for identifying and exploiting successful entrepreneurs who were vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. The 3 men who kidnapped you, Morrison continued, addressing Noelle directly, were hired through intermediaries and given very specific instructions. They weren't supposed to kill you immediately. The plan was to force you to transfer significant assets to offshore accounts, then stage your death to look like a suicide motivated by business failure. Suicide? Noelle's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Trevor had been preparing the narrative for months. Morrison explained. Public statements about your stress levels, concerns about company performance, hints about your mental health. If the kidnapping had proceeded as planned, your death would have looked like the tragic end to an entrepreneur who couldn't handle the pressure of success. Conan's expression had grown, increasingly dark as Morrison outlined the scope of Trevor's planning. Where is he now? That's the problem, Morrison admitted. Trevor disappeared sometime yesterday evening, probably around the time Noelle was supposed to be making her forced financial transfers. He cleared out several accounts, destroyed documents at his office, and appears to have activated an escape plan he'd been developing for months. So he's gone, Noelle said, feeling a complex mix of relief and frustration. He's stolen from my company and tried to have me killed, but he's gone. Not gone, Morrison corrected. Hidden, and that's what makes this situation particularly dangerous. Morrison opened another folder, this one containing surveillance photographs and financial records that revealed the true scope of Trevor's operations. He hadn't been working alone. The financial fraud at Draven Dynamics was part of a larger network that included accomplices in multiple states, sophisticated money laundering operations, and resources that suggested significant organizational backing. Men who kidnapped you were low-level contractors, Morrison explained. But the financial infrastructure behind this operation indicates that Trevor is connected to much more serious criminals. People who invest significant money in these schemes and expect returns regardless of complications. Meaning? Conan asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the implications. Meaning that Noelle is still in danger, Morrison said bluntly. Trevor's associates have invested time and money in taking control of Draven Dynamics. The fact that their plan failed doesn't eliminate their financial motivation. The room fell silent as they absorbed this information. What had seemed like a successful rescue and the end of an immediate threat was actually the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous situation. Noelle wasn't just a kidnapping victim who needed temporary protection. She was a target in an ongoing financial conspiracy that had already murdered other entrepreneurs in similar situations. What are my options? Noelle asked finally, officially. We're coordinating with federal authorities to investigate the financial crimes and track Trevor's associates, Morrison replied. That process will take months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee we'll be able to neutralize the threat completely. And unofficially? Morrison glanced at Conan before answering. Unofficially, you need to disappear until we can determine the full scope of this conspiracy. New identity, new location, complete disconnection from your previous life until it's safe to resurface. The suggestion hit Noelle like a physical blow. Disappearing meant abandoning Draven Dynamics, the company she'd built from nothing and which employed 47 people who depended on their jobs. It meant walking away from the only life she'd ever known, even if that life had become a carefully controlled prison. I can't do that, she said immediately. My company, my employees, my responsibility to— Your responsibility is to stay alive, Morrison interrupted. Draven Dynamics is already compromised. Trevor's theft has left the company financially unstable, and his associates will use whatever leverage they can find to force you into compliance with their demands. Conan had been listening to this conversation with growing recognition of a dilemma he understood intimately. Noelle was facing the same choice he'd confronted after Lisa's death, whether to rebuild a life that had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, or to retreat into protective isolation that might be safer but would never feel like truly living. There's another option, he said quietly, earning surprised looks from both Morrison and Noelle. What option? Morrison asked. Fight back, Conan replied. Not by hiding, but by making it too expensive and dangerous for these people to continue targeting her. Morrison shook her head immediately. Mr. Cliver, I appreciate what you did last night, but this isn't a situation that can be resolved through combat training. These are professional criminals with substantial resources and no moral constraints. I'm not talking about direct confrontation, Conan clarified. I'm talking about making Noelle a target. That's more trouble than she's worth. Removing their financial incentive by protecting their investment until law enforcement can eliminate the threat permanently. How would that work? Noelle asked, intrigued despite herself. Conan looked directly at her, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her of the moment he'd appeared in the warehouse. Absolute certainty combined with willingness to act on principle regardless of personal cost. You don't disappear, he said. Instead, you fight to rebuild Draven Dynamics while I make sure Trevor's associates understand that targeting you will be more expensive than walking away. The suggestion was audacious and dangerous, requiring Noelle to trust not only Conan's ability to protect her, but also her own capacity to reclaim control of a life that had been systematically dismantled. But sitting in Detective Morrison's office, processing the scope of Trevor's betrayal and the magnitude of the threat she still faced, Noelle realized she'd reached a decision point that would define everything that came after. She could choose safety through disappearance, abandoning everything she'd built to protect herself from people who'd already stolen her autonomy. Or she could choose the much more dangerous path of fighting to reclaim her life, trusting a man she'd known for 12 hours who seemed to understand something about courage that she'd forgotten was possible. Looking at Conan's steady expression, remembering how he'd risked everything to save a stranger, Noelle made the second independent decision of her new life. What would fighting back actually look like? She asked. The next 3 weeks transformed Noelle's understanding of what life could feel like when choices were made independently rather than strategically. Conan's apartment became their operational headquarters, a space where she discovered the strange luxury of existing without performance or pretense. Every morning began with coffee that tasted genuine, because no one was evaluating her responses or measuring her productivity against corporate expectations. Working from Conan's kitchen table, Noelle began the complex process of untangling Trevor's financial web while rebuilding Draven Dynamics' actual operational capabilities. She discovered that reclaiming her own company required learning to think like herself again rather than anticipating what others expected her to conclude. The process was exhausting and liberating in equal measure. Conan maintained his night shift schedule at Thornfield Industrial Complex, but his presence during daylight hours provided a kind of security Noelle had never experienced. He wasn't managing her decisions or filtering her information, just ensuring she had space to work without constantly checking over her shoulder for threats. His approach to protection was subtle and respectful, more like having a guardian who understood boundaries than a bodyguard who controlled access. During their shared meals, Noelle learned about Conan's perspective on life choices and personal responsibility. He spoke about his combat training not as preparation for violence, but as education in assessing risks and responding appropriately to dangerous situations. His philosophy centered on developing capabilities that allowed for independent action rather than depending on others for protection or rescue. The goal isn't to become someone who can't be hurt, he explained. One evening while helping her organize financial documents that revealed the scope of Trevor's theft, the goal is to become someone who can handle being hurt and still make good decisions. The distinction resonated with Noelle's situation in ways that traditional business advice never had. She was learning to rebuild her company not by avoiding future betrayals, but by developing systems that could detect and respond to manipulation before it became catastrophic. Her relationship with Draven Dynamics employees required delicate navigation as she worked to restore their confidence while investigating which team members might have been unknowingly complicit in Trevor's schemes. Several staff meetings conducted via secure video calls revealed that most employees had noticed irregularities but hadn't felt empowered to question financial decisions that came from executive leadership. Should have created better communication channels, Noelle told Conan after a particularly difficult conversation with her development team. People saw problems but didn't feel safe reporting them. You were isolated from those communication channels yourself, Conan pointed out. Hard to create systems for receiving information when you weren't getting accurate information either. The observation helped Noelle understand that rebuilding her company meant reconstructing not just financial controls, but cultural expectations about transparency and individual responsibility. She began implementing new protocols that encouraged direct communication and distributed decision-making authority in ways that would make future manipulation more difficult. Her daily routine with Conan developed a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than scheduled. They shared breakfast while reviewing overnight developments in the investigation. Noelle worked on company business while Conan slept, and they reconvened in the afternoons to discuss progress and plan next steps. Evenings often included walks through Millhaven's Arts District, where Noelle discovered neighborhoods she'd lived near for years but never explored. The conversations during these walks revealed aspects of both their personalities that emergency situations hadn't allowed for examination. Conan was methodical and observant, someone who noticed details about their environment and the people they encountered. Noelle was discovering that without the pressure of constant performance, she was naturally curious and analytical, someone who enjoyed solving complex problems when the solutions weren't predetermined by other people's agendas. Most importantly, Noelle was learning to trust her own judgment again. Small decisions about what to eat for lunch or which route to take during their walks became exercises in independent choice-making. Larger decisions about company strategy and legal approaches were made through consultation with Conan and Detective Morrison, but the final authority remained clearly with Noelle herself. The transformation wasn't just psychological. Physical changes accompanied her emotional growth as she began eating regularly, sleeping without medication, and moving through the world without constantly managing her appearance for public consumption. Her skin looked healthier, her posture became more relaxed, and her laugh returned to something spontaneous rather than socially appropriate. 3 weeks into this new existence, Noelle realized she was experiencing something she'd forgotten was possible. Anticipation for the future based on her own goals, rather than other people's expectations. The feeling was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, like discovering she had capabilities she'd never been allowed to develop. The first sign of escalating danger came through Detective Morrison's late-night phone call on a Thursday that had otherwise felt routine and manageable. Conan answered immediately, recognizing the urgency in Morrison's tone even before she explained that Trevor's associates had made contact with federal investigators through intermediaries who claimed to represent legitimate business interests. They're offering a negotiated settlement, Morrison explained during an emergency meeting at police headquarters. Return of some stolen assets in exchange for Noel signing documents that would essentially transfer majority control of Draven Dynamics to a shell corporation they control. Which means they still want the company, Noel said, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety return to her stomach. Just through legal mechanisms instead of kidnapping, the timeline suggests. They're under pressure from their own investors, Morrison continued. Our investigation has frozen several accounts they were using for money laundering, and they need liquidity from Draven Dynamics to satisfy financial obligations to some very serious people. Conan studied the documents Morrison had spread across the conference table, recognizing patterns from his former work in financial software security. How much time are they giving for a response? 72 hours, Morrison replied. After that, they've indicated that alternative approaches will be necessary to resolve their financial concerns. The euphemism was clear to everyone in the room. Trevor's associates were threatening escalated violence if Noel didn't voluntarily surrender control of her company within 3 days. The negotiated settlement was essentially a ransom demand with legal documentation. What's the federal response? Noel asked. Officially, they're advising you to consider the offer seriously, Morrison said carefully. The amount of money involved makes this a priority case, but they can't guarantee your physical safety if you refuse to cooperate. And unofficially? Morrison glanced at Conan before answering. Unofficially, they think you should take whatever money you can recover and disappear permanently. These people have killed entrepreneurs in similar situations when cooperation wasn't forthcoming. The room fell silent as they processed the implications. What had begun as financial fraud had evolved into something approaching organized crime, with Noel caught between surrendering her life's work and risking her actual life. The choice was stark and immediate in ways that made their previous planning seem naive and optimistic. There's additional information you need to consider, Morrison continued, opening another file that contains surveillance photographs and intelligence reports. Trevor has been located in Montreal, but he's not operating independently. The network he's connected to has resources that include professional enforcers and sophisticated surveillance capabilities. The photographs showed Trevor meeting with individuals who clearly weren't business associates. The intelligence reports detailed a pattern of intimidation and violence used against entrepreneurs who'd resisted similar takeover attempts in other states. The scope of the criminal enterprise was far larger than anyone had initially understood. How did they find entrepreneurs to target? Conan asked, studying the documentation with growing recognition of the systematic nature of the operation. Business publications, conference attendance, financial reports, Morrison explained. They identify successful companies with single founders who don't have sophisticated security or legal protections. Trevor's job was to infiltrate the target companies and create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And if the infiltration approach failed, then they moved to more direct methods, Morrison said grimly. Kidnapping, extortion, or elimination of the business owner, followed by acquisition of company assets through manipulated legal processes. Noel realized she was looking at documentation of her own planned murder, disguised as a business transaction. Trevor's romantic relationship with her hadn't been personal manipulation. It had been professional preparation for a criminal enterprise that viewed her as nothing more than an Obstacle to asset acquisition. The 72-hour deadline isn't random, Conan observed, identifying patterns in the documentation that suggested operational planning. They're coordinating with other activities that require specific timing. Morrison nodded. Federal investigators think they're preparing to liquidate several targets simultaneously before moving operations to a different region. Noel's situation is part of a larger extraction plan. The revelation transformed their tactical situation completely. Fighting back was no longer about reclaiming one company from one fraudulent partner. It was about disrupting a criminal network that was prepared to murder multiple people to complete their financial objectives. The stakes had escalated beyond anything their previous planning had anticipated. What are our realistic options? Noel asked, though her tone suggested she already understood that the choices had narrowed dramatically. Accept the settlement and hope they honor the agreement, Morrison replied. Disappear completely and hope they decide you're not worth pursuing. Or find a way to make them abandon their plans before the deadline expires. How would that work? Conan asked. Morrison spread out additional documents that revealed the complexity of Trevor's network and their financial dependencies. They need liquidity from multiple sources to satisfy their own obligations. If several of their targets become inaccessible simultaneously, the entire operation becomes unprofitable. Meaning that if we can protect enough of their targets, the whole network might collapse from financial pressure, rather than individual resistance. The suggestion was audacious in its scope and risk. Instead of focusing solely on Noel's safety, they would need to coordinate with federal authorities and other potential victims to simultaneously disrupt multiple criminal operations across several states. The approach could neutralize the threat permanently. But it would also expose Noel to maximum danger during the coordination period. Sitting in the police conference room, surrounded by evidence of systematic predation and planned violence, Noel faced the most consequential decision of her life. She could accept defeat and hope for survival, or she could choose to fight, not just for herself, but for every entrepreneur these criminals had targeted. The choice would determine not just her own future, but whether Trevor's network would continue destroying other people's lives with impunity. The argument between Conan and Noel began quietly in the police station parking lot, but intensified as they drove back to his apartment through Millhaven's evening traffic. What started as a disagreement about tactical approaches had revealed fundamental differences in their perspectives on responsibility, protection, and the acceptable level of risk when fighting for principles versus survival. Coordinating with federal authorities to protect multiple targets simultaneously is suicide, Conan said, his voice controlled but firm as they stopped at a red light. You're talking about making yourself the primary target for a criminal network that has already tried to kill you once. I'm talking about stopping them permanently, instead of just postponing my own problems, Noel replied, staring out the passenger window at ordinary people going about their evening routines without wondering if they were being surveilled by professional criminals. If we don't disrupt their entire operation, they'll just wait and try again when we're less prepared. That's not your responsibility, Conan said, the light turning green as his frustration became more apparent. Your responsibility is to stay alive and rebuild your life, not to save every other entrepreneur who might be targeted by these people. The statement hung between them as they navigated the familiar streets toward his apartment, each recognizing that their disagreement touched on deeper questions about moral obligation and personal agency. Noel had spent years having her choices limited by other people's definitions of what she should or shouldn't risk. Conan had spent years avoiding emotional investment that might lead to the kind of loss he'd experienced with Lisa. Lisa, you saved my life because you believed it was the right thing to do, Noel said as they climbed the stairs to his apartment. You didn't know me, didn't know if helping me would put you in danger, didn't know if I was worth the risk. You acted on principle. That was different, Conan replied. unlocking his door with movements that were sharper than usual. That was an immediate situation requiring immediate action. This is a choice to voluntarily enter a prolonged conflict with people who have infinite resources and no moral constraints. How is it different? Noel pressed, following him into the kitchen where their previous conversations had established a foundation of mutual respect that now felt strained. You're telling me to prioritize my safety over other people who are in exactly the situation I was in. 3 weeks ago, Conan set his keys down with deliberate precision, turning to face her with an expression that combined frustration with something that looked like fear. Because 3 weeks ago, I didn't know you. Now I do. And I'm not prepared to watch someone I care about get killed for a principle that might not work. The admission shifted the emotional landscape of their argument, introducing personal attachment as a factor that complicated their tactical discussion. Noel realized that Conan's resistance wasn't just about risk assessment, it was about his own inability to handle another loss after building emotional connections he'd been avoiding for years. So your solution is to make my choices for me? Noel asked, her voice rising as she recognized the familiar pattern of well-meaning control. You want to protect me by limiting my options to the ones you think are safe? I want to protect you by using my judgment about situations I understand better than you do, Conan replied, his own voice becoming sharper. I've been studying violence and dangerous people for 8 years. You've been studying software development and business management. Which of us is better qualified to assess the risks of confronting organized criminals? Which of us is better qualified to decide what I'm willing to risk for my own principles? Noel shot back. You're doing exactly what Trevor did, taking control of my decisions because you think you know better than I do what I can handle. Comparison to Trevor was devastating and unfair, and Noel regretted it as soon as the words left her mouth. But the anger driving her response came from years of having her autonomy eroded by people who claimed to be protecting her best interests. Conan's expression went very still, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet in a way that suggested carefully controlled emotion. Trevor manipulated you for financial gain and tried to have you killed when you became inconvenient. I'm trying to keep you alive because I care about you. If you can't see the difference, then maybe you're not ready to make decisions about your own safety. Maybe you're not ready to care about someone without trying to control them, Noel replied, recognizing that they'd reached the core of their conflict. You saved my life, and I'm grateful. But that doesn't give you the right to decide how I use the life you saved. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic sounds from the street below. Both of them stood surrounded by the evidence of 3 weeks spent learning to work together, to trust each other's judgment, to build something that felt like partnership. Now they were discovering that partnership had limits when fundamental values came into conflict. I can't watch you walk into a situation that will probably get you killed, Conan said finally, his voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than their immediate argument. I spent 8 years learning to live with losing someone I loved. I'm not strong enough to do it again, and I can't live with knowing that my survival came at the cost of other people's lives, Noel replied, understanding that they'd reached an impasse that couldn't be resolved through compromise. I spent 8 years letting other people make my choices for me. I won't go back to that, even for someone I care about. The mutual acknowledgement of caring made their disagreement more painful rather than providing common ground for resolution. They cared about each other enough to want protection and respect, but those desires were mutually exclusive given the nature of the decision they faced. So what happens now? Conan asked, leaning against the kitchen counter as if he needed physical support for an emotional conversation that had drained his usual steady composure. Now I make my own choice, Noel said, though her voice carried sadness rather than triumph. And you make yours. They both understood what those choices would be. Noel would coordinate with federal authorities to help disrupt Trevor's network, accepting the risks that came with choosing principle over safety. Conan would either support her decision while managing his own fear, or he would step back to protect himself from another devastating loss. Standing in the kitchen where they'd learned to trust each other, they realized that love sometimes meant respecting someone's right to make choices you couldn't support, even when those choices might destroy everything you'd hoped to build. Together, Noelle moved out of Conan's apartment the next morning while he was sleeping, leaving only a brief note that thanked him for everything and explained that she needed space to handle the federal coordination without worrying about his emotional response to the risks involved. The decision felt both necessary and devastating, like amputating a limb to save the body. She rented a secure furnished apartment downtown through Detective Morrison's contacts, a space designed for witness protection that offered sophisticated security systems and limited access points. The apartment was sterile and functional, the opposite of Conan's warm space filled with books and evidence of a life lived authentically. But it provided what she needed: privacy to work with federal authorities and isolation that would keep Conan safe from retaliation if her plans failed. The federal coordination proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit explained that Trevor's network had tentacles reaching into banking systems, legal firms, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Disrupting their operations required precise timing and absolute secrecy, since any leaked information would allow the criminals to disappear. With their stolen assets, we're coordinating with 7 other victims in 5 states, Torres explained during their first strategy meeting. Each target represents millions in stolen assets, and each individual's safety depends on all the others maintaining operational security until we move. Simultaneously, Noelle found herself serving as both victim and consultant, using her technical expertise to help federal investigators understand how Trevor's financial manipulation had worked. Her software development background proved invaluable in tracking digital trails and identifying vulnerabilities in the network's money laundering systems. Working 18-hour days from her secure apartment, Noelle discovered capabilities she'd never been allowed to develop during her years under Trevor's control. She could analyze complex financial data, coordinate with law enforcement across jurisdictions, and maintain operational security while managing multiple moving parts simultaneously. The pressure was intense, but it felt like using muscles that had been dormant for years. The most difficult aspect wasn't the technical complexity, or even the physical danger. It was functioning without Conan's steady presence and perspective. She'd grown accustomed to his quiet competence and principled approach to decision-making. Working alone, she had to develop confidence in her own judgment without external validation or support. Agent Torres noticed her isolation during their 3rd week of coordination. "You seem like someone who's used to working with a partner," she observed after a particularly long planning session. "Is there someone you trust who could provide support without compromising operational security?" "There was," Noelle replied carefully. "But we disagreed about whether this approach was worth the risk. And you chose the mission over the relationship?" "I chose my own judgment over someone else's fear for my safety," Noelle corrected. "Even someone whose fear came from caring about me." Torres nodded with the understanding of someone who'd navigated similar conflicts between personal relationships and professional obligations. "That's the hardest choice in dangerous work. People who care about you want to keep you safe, but safety and effectiveness are sometimes mutually exclusive." Meanwhile, Conan was struggling with his own learning curve about respect versus protection. He'd returned from his night shift to find Noelle's note and most of her belongings gone, leaving his apartment feeling empty in ways that went beyond physical space. The experience forced him to confront whether his desire to protect her had crossed the line into controlling her choices. He maintained his work schedule at Thornfield Industrial Complex, but his evenings were spent walking through Mill Haven's Arts District, thinking about the difference between supporting someone and trying to manage their decisions. The distinction was subtle but crucial, requiring him to separate his emotional needs from her autonomy. Jake Santos, his combat instructor, noticed the change during their training sessions. "You're fighting like someone who's lost something important," Jake observed after a particularly intense sparring match. "Want to talk about what's eating at you? Talk about what's eating at you." "I met someone who needed help," Conan explained, his words carefully chosen. "I helped her, then tried to keep helping even when she didn't want that kind of help anymore." "Ah," Jake said, recognizing a familiar pattern. "You learn to rescue people, but you never learned when to stop rescuing them." "She's in real danger," Conan protested. "Serious, life-threatening danger from people who have already tried to kill her once. And she chose to face that danger anyway," Jake replied. "Which means your job is to respect her choice, not to override it because you think you know better." The conversation forced Conan to examine his motivations more honestly. His desire to protect Noelle wasn't just about her safety, it was about his own fear of experiencing another devastating loss. He'd been trying to manage her choices to manage his own emotional risk, which was exactly the kind of controlling behavior she'd spent years escaping. 2 weeks into their separation, Conan received an encrypted message through Detective Morrison asking if he would be willing to provide tactical support for the federal operation, without trying to influence Noelle's participation. The request represented a choice between sulking about her decision and finding ways to support her goals while respecting her autonomy. He spent 3 days considering the offer, recognizing that accepting it meant acknowledging that Noelle had been right about her own capabilities and judgment. She didn't need him to rescue her from this situation. She needed him to trust that she could handle it while being available if she requested specific assistance. His response was simple: available if needed. Respecting her leadership on operational decisions. The message represented a fundamental shift in how Conan understood love and partnership. True support meant believing in someone's strength rather than focusing on their vulnerability, trusting their judgment rather than substituting your own, and being present for their choices rather than trying to prevent them from making difficult ones. 3 weeks into their separation, both Noelle and Conan had proven something important to themselves and each other. Noelle could navigate complex dangers and make sound decisions under pressure without external guidance or protection. Conan could care deeply about someone while respecting their right to take risks he couldn't support. Emotionally, the federal operation was entering its final phase, and success would depend on whether they could work together as equals rather than as protector and protected. Everything they'd learned about independence and respect was about to be tested in circumstances where both their lives would depend on trusting each other's judgment completely. Coordinated operation to dismantle Trevor's network began at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, with federal agents simultaneously executing warrants in 5 states while Noelle provided real-time technical support from a command center established in Millhaven's federal building. The months of preparation had led to this moment, when 7 entrepreneurs would either reclaim their stolen lives or watch Trevor's organization disappear with millions in assets and the freedom to target other victims. Conan arrived at the command center an hour before the operation commenced, carrying tactical equipment and wearing the focused expression that Noelle remembered from the warehouse rescue. But this time, his presence felt different. He wasn't there to make decisions for her or to manage risks she couldn't handle herself. He was there to provide specialized support for plans she had developed and leadership she would provide. Status on the Montreal location? Agent Torres asked as federal teams prepared to move against Trevor's coordination center. Surveillance confirms he's in the building, Noelle replied. Monitoring multiple data streams from her position at the technical coordination desk. Financial transfers show they're attempting to liquidate remaining assets before our freeze orders take effect. How long before they realize the operation is coordinated? Conan asked, studying the tactical displays that showed federal team positions across multiple states. Probably minutes after we hit the first location, Torres replied. Which is why timing is critical. Every team moves simultaneously, and Ms. Draven's technical support ensures we track any escape, attempts or emergency asset transfers. The operation unfolded with precision that demonstrated months of careful planning and coordination. Federal teams struck financial offices, safe houses, and coordination centers while Noel monitored digital communications and financial systems that might allow Trevor's network to escape with stolen assets. Her role was central and demanding, requiring split-second decisions about technical countermeasures and real-time coordination with agents across multiple jurisdictions. Conan's contribution was exactly what she needed: tactical assessment of security situations, threat analysis when complications developed, and calm competence that allowed her to focus on technical challenges without worrying about physical security. He provided expertise without overriding her decisions, support without attempting control, partnership without attempting to manage her responses to stress. Denver team reports resistance at the financial center. Torres announced as the operation entered its second hour. They need technical support to prevent data destruction. Noel's fingers moved across multiple keyboards simultaneously, establishing secure connections and implementing countermeasures she developed during weeks of preparation. Implementing backup protocols now. They should have access to secured systems within 90 seconds. What if the resistance escalates? Conan asked, recognizing tactical patterns from his combat training. Then I adapt the technical approach. Noel replied without looking away from her screens. That's why we have multiple contingencies for each